The Quaestio Disputate, alongside the Lectio, was integral to the heart of the scholastic curriculum. Rather than authoritatively determining the answers in advance, the Quaestio Disputate allowed students and teachers alike to grapple with the intricacies of complex issues as they continually developed within the halls of the university. I am Brian Kemple of Continuum Philosophical Insight, and this is the first in a lengthy series of recordings constituting a Quaestiones Disputatae de Quodlibet. In this recording in particular, I will not answer any of the questions or go into any details about the production of the Quaestiones Disputatae de Quodlibet, the first series, but instead we'll just give a bit of an overview, an introduction, and summarize by means of headings the different questions and articles to which you can look forward in the coming months. Now, to introduce the concept of the Quaestio Disputate, it's helpful to consider the description given to it by Bernardo Bosson. Quote, "A disputed question is a regular form of teaching, apprenticeship, and research, presided over by a master, characterized by a dialectical method which consists of bringing forward and examining arguments, based on reason and authority, which oppose one another on a given theoretical or practical problem, and which are furnished by participants, and where the master must come to a doctrinal solution by an act of determination, which confirms him in his function as master." The practice had two regular formats. First was the official Quaestio Disputate, which was focused upon a specific topic that was treated at great length, resulting, for instance, in Thomas Aquinas' Quaestiones Disputatae de Veritate, the disputed questions on truth, or the Quaestiones Disputatae de Potentia Dei, the disputed questions on the power of God. The other format was the Quaestiones Disputatae de Quodlibet, the disputed questions, literally, on whatever, where the former were classes of a sort, taken by students who studied under a specific master. The latter were open to the public, often being attended by a wide variety of students who did not study under that master, as well as by other masters, and even by some educated persons outside the university. Where the former sort were focused, the latter ranged, and often quite widely. Now, this dialectical approach to education subsided in the ensuing centuries, as authoritative speaking became increasingly focused on monological proclamations, given through books and through lectures, and so the dialectical approach of the Quaestio Disputate turned into an insular practice maintained only by remote institutions which kept up a scholastic discipline, but which did not have the cultural relevance that the disputed questions of, say, the 13th century had. That is, while the monks may have continued the practice in their monasteries and in faithful Catholic universities, it was a practice which had less and less effect on the public, particularly in the wake of the Protestant Revolution. Now, fortunately, among the revivals of the scribal, monastic way of life, which have been and are continuing to be affected by the new digital paradigm, is the capacity for the dialectical. That is, we are no longer constrained to exchanging our thoughts in mass media through centralized or unidirectional means. We are no longer being crowded out when we try to have an independent voice. News broadcasts, television personalities, and major publishers no longer have the stranglehold on thought that they have had for the past century or more. And so what you have before you here, both in these recorded presentations and also eventually in a textual format as well, is a revival of the Quaestiones Disputatei de Quodlibet. with questions and objections submitted anonymously via a digital form, and subsequently collated, revised, supplemented, and formatted by myself. I'm presenting here 3 distinct questions, each of which contains a plurality of articles, within which specific objections are advanced and responses given. Much like the scholastic Quaestiones Disputatae, positions are taken from both sides of an issue, such that each article has both objections and at least one sed contra. The answer I give to each article may agree with one or another side more than the other, but typically falls somewhere closer to a third position altogether. Responses to both objections and sed contra positions are given as needed, frequently to the former and less frequently to the latter. Now, I have tried to signify every position in the strongest language, and every argument in the strongest structure that I found possible to produce, while nevertheless maintaining a certain economic brevity. Then I have also added a proemium to each question and article, and each being a summary of the difficulties found therein. It is my sincerest hope that those who submitted questions have gained from the exercise already, and will gain something more yet from my answers, just as I gained from writing them, and that together we will benefit all who read. Now, to give an overview of the contents of these Quaestiones de Quodlibet, the 3 questions are on, first, knowledge; second, on existence and being, or on esse and ens; and third, on God. Now, there were some questions submitted which did not fit these paradigms, and while initially I have laid them out in a sort of miscellaneous answer or question, I think I will treat those separately in a different document and a different presentation altogether, as I'm a big fan of things being coherent and things being held in a unity. So questions on politics or physics, for instance, which just didn't fit with the majority of the responses that I received, have been excised from this particular document, from this particular presentation, as I thought it was just a little too incongruous. I do intend to answer them. I will just answer them in a different format, in a different document or what have you. How exactly has not yet been determined. At any rate, the question on knowledge, I received a number of, probably the second most number of questions as regards this, and many of them were short objections, some of them were longer, and so I tried my best to bring them into nice, clean articles. So the first article on the question of knowledge is, how does intellectual knowledge differ from sensory knowledge? That is, it's been contested throughout modernity, and especially even after the sort of philosophical modernity has waned into the irrelevance of contemporary analytic philosophy. It has been maintained that what we conceive of as intellection is nothing more than a more sophisticated consequence of sensation than is found in other animals, differing only in degree and not really in kind. That there's really nothing about human cognition which is that unique. It's only more developed. The contrary of this are those who hold that intellect is somehow something completely different from sensation, that it's entirely distinct, that it's indicative of human beings as purely spiritual beings and not really physical things at all, or that we're only incidentally or accidentally physical, or that if we are physical and intellectual, the two are sort of hypostatically joined together, that our nature is inherently twofold somehow. So mediating these two positions, finding where they get things right and really where they mostly get things wrong, is the objective of the first article in the question on knowledge, an article on how does intellectual knowledge differ from sensation. Continuing from this is, in Article 2, the question of how can the intellect be immaterial? That, looking at what we know today, that how much dependence there is for our cognitive activity upon the functioning of the brain, it's argued that there is no good answer for how or what it even means for the intellect to be immaterial. This was just sort of a kind of immateriality of the gaps, as it were, which we have since closed over with scientific research. And this is a position which, holding that the intellect is immaterial, is somehow seen as a kind of fantasy view today. So dealing with that is the objective of the second article. And Article 3, which might seem a little bit disparate at first, is the question of what is first philosophy, or perhaps what do we mean by the phrase first philosophy. And this deals with really three issues, I guess you could say. The first being that for Aristotle, first philosophy was a term reserved for metaphysics, and Aquinas and most of the scholastics who were good Aristotelians followed Aristotle in this denomination of metaphysics as first philosophy because it deals with the first principles of being. By contrast, in modern philosophy, we find that Descartes is most famous for his Meditations, but sometimes people don't even know the full title of the work, which is Meditations de Prima Philosophia, or Meditaciones de Prima Philosophia. Meditations on first philosophy. And although God is the, I guess you could say, ontological starting point or basis for Descartes' works there, for his thinking, the cogito, although it doesn't actually appear in that work in those exact words, but the indisputability of one's own thinking existence is the methodological starting point for Descartes. And with that turn, that subjective turn that Descartes introduces, first philosophy goes from being about God and about being in general to being about our knowledge. And with that is invented, so to speak, the science of epistemology, this science of a theory of knowledge. For reasons I won't get into here, at any length, I do object generally to the term epistemology, as it makes one thing out of something that really belongs to others. In other words, what's covered by epistemology is a sort of chimera built out of pieces of logic, study of philosophical psychology and metaphysics. And so it's an unnatural philosophical science, I think. But correspondingly in this discussion is the question of semiotics. This question was posed to me particularly as the doctoral student of John Deely, and the way that Deely treats of semiotics is as a kind of first philosophy. Although the position I take, and as I'll explain later on, there's a way in which there's room for two first philosophies, if we understand first to be said in multiple ways. So that's the objective of the third and final question on knowledge, which is, far from any sort of comprehensive presentation of a theory of knowledge, but is really simply a series of attempts to clarify some possible misconceptions which might undermine the philosophical endeavor, particularly of a Thomist or of a semiotic Thomist such as myself. So now question 2 on essence and being. This question has 5 articles. The first is on what does it mean to exist? What does the term existence or esse mean, and how is this related to the term ens or the term being? And here I touch also on German philosophy, and particularly the philosophy of Heidegger and Kant, as people who have had profound influence on the questions of being, what being means. And so there's a lot of linguistic distinctions that I draw within there, and we'll see how clear I'm able to make those in the sort of final draft of this. Article 2 of the question on existence and being is whether or not essence is included in existence. And here we're getting into something like the question of the real distinction between essence and existence, whether essence means anything apart from existence, or whether existence means anything apart from essence. And so there we're dipping toes into, I think, some more traditional debates, some ones that have been going on for quite some time, particularly since the 1879 Scholastic Revival, or more specifically, Thomistic Revival. Article 3 of Question 2 is, what is the meaning of the phrase ex nihilo, or from nothing? And this is an important question in terms of navigating the difficulties of understanding existence and understanding creation, or the existence of things that are created, since it is said that God creates ex nihilo. And so I believe that this question was probably raised in response to, or in seeking of some clarification of the kinds of claims that you find made by, say, Stephen Hawking or Lawrence Krauss or Neil deGrasse Tyson, or really any popular writing physicist who has, in the past 50 or so years, made this claim that the universe has come out of nothing. And so we'll see, just exactly what that means and how we can respond to such claims. Article 4 is the question of how is being known. What does it mean to say that we know being? What is it that we can say that we understand? And this will draw a lot, actually, on the first article as well, and probably some points raised in the first question, in terms of distinguishing the object of our knowledge and how knowledge is produced by us in our thinking. Article 5 is, I know exactly who raised this objection. This is the question of how does one enter the science of metaphysics? And this is a long-standing debate in Thomist circles, particularly in the last 100 or so years. And it's one that certain schools and people in certain schools love to debate. To me, it's actually not that interesting of a question, but I do think it is worthy of some attention and of trying to give an answer to. There's various ways in which you can interpret Aristotle, and especially interpret Aquinas in interpreting Aristotle, as for how one begins the study of the specific, clearly delineated science of metaphysics, how we get to this notion of being in general, or being as being, and how we are able to understand it as a distinct subject or set of objects for philosophical inquiry. So there's a good number of objections and sed contra, which present the different positions, and I will try to give as an authoritative an answer as I am equipped to do so. And then finally, in question 3 on God, there are again 5 articles. The first is, does God exist? And here in particular, I'm not going to be presenting original arguments for the existence of God, but rather responding to some common misunderstandings of Aquinas' 5 ways. And in particular here I'm thinking of J. Dyer, and some of the arguments that I've seen him use that I've also seen Twitter atheists and other online atheists use, which largely seem to stem from some profound misunderstandings of terms and what terms signify. And a large part of the reason that I put the question of God after the questions on knowledge and the questions on metaphysics is that I will draw on those heavily to show how these are misunderstandings of what Aquinas is saying. The second article is the question that if God is the ultimate cause of all things, then how can human beings be said to have free will? Now, in a way, this is really more a question about humans than it is about God, but I will be looking here primarily to the metaphysical nature of the answer, to the metaphysical nature of God as perfect act, and how perfect act does not contradict freedom, does not contradict the free choice of the will. Article 3 will address the specific question of what does it mean to say that God thinks, as there are times in which we discuss God's knowledge or God's reasoning, as it were, by kind of analogizing to our own operations, to our own actions. And so again, I'll be drawing on this notion of perfect act and explaining the sort of analogical mode through which we need to approach any sort of articulation of God's attributes or properties, which is carried over into the fourth article of what does it mean to say that God acts. And here in particular, I believe the concern has to do with transitive action, as transitive action implies an imperfection on the one acting, and so how can it be that God, who is all perfect, transitively acts in any way, that God acts on things which are not himself, which are outside of himself in a certain way. So we'll have to dig into some issues there about ontological dependence and what have you, to clarify the meaning of the statement that God acts. And there's some other particular issues which arise there, right? About God's efficiency and the distinction of God's creation from himself, and a number of interesting nuances. And then finally, Article 5 is the question of whether God is being or is God unity, and what does it mean to situate the concept of the Trinity and the distinction of the persons within an understanding of God's being or God's unity. Is there really only one God if there are three persons in God? Obviously we'll be getting into some heavy, difficult discussions there, particularly concerning the processions of the persons and the relations, and how you can have three distinct relations within something which is one in substance, which is a real mind bender. But I've been going on for a lot longer now than I thought I would, and like I said, this will be a lengthy series of videos, and this is just the introduction. So I hope in the near future to be able to put out a video on knowledge, the first question, and particularly really probably just spending time on the first article, as this has grown to a much greater length than I anticipated. When I initially received the questions and sort of laid out my outline, I thought that, I could probably write this whole thing in about 20,000 words. And I'm not finished writing yet. I've actually only fully answered the first question and answered a rough draft of the second question, and I have notes on the third. But with just, a rough draft of answers to the articles in question 2, already at 31,000 words. So this has really turned into a small book, all on its own, which is fine. I don't have any problem with that, and I'm not in any rush to produce things. But I do think it is helpful for me to start doing these recordings as a way of keeping myself on pace and keeping myself engaged with answering these questions on whatever. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to getting any sort of feedback that you might have as these recordings are continued in their production. Thank you.